Leonardo DiCaprio.
Miss Anne Hathaway.
Meryl Streep, The Iron Lady.
Alan Arkin in Little Miss Sunshine.
Kevin Costner.
The King's Speech.
Birdman.
I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Redoing the Oscars. And this week we're going to be covering the 2011 Oscars year, talking about the Best Actress category, who I would have picked that was nominated, who I would have picked who was unnominated to maybe get a nomination or maybe even win, and then try to figure out ultimately, did the Academy get it right, while also providing some, important Oscars context of what this year was. We've been having a lot of time righting wrongs, redoing the Oscars, picking one of those key categories, whether it be the acting categories or picture or director, and talking about year by year, what would be the one pick that maybe we would redo, or I would personally redo. At the end we talk about whether or not that was the right thing or the wrong thing, trying to take a more objective point of view of things, but I usually like this as an opportunity to talk about someone who was already nominated for the Oscars, who I really like, who I think maybe, deserves more love and analysis, and I talk about why I love their performance or the film so much. But then we also like to talk about unnominated movies, because as you know, so many years, in particular for this year, I think, there are so many great movies that weren't even nominated for acting Oscars or for Best Picture or any Oscars generally, and yet over time we recognize those to be classics, and maybe we want to reward them. So of course, it's easy to kind of look back on things and redo things, 10 plus years later, but that's the fun of this exercise. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. You guys have been active in terms of commenting and letting me know your thoughts on the movies, or who you would have picked as well in terms of, your unnominated or nominated picks. Just a fun way to kind of share your thoughts on this year of the Oscars. But without further ado, let's jump into things, starting off with that Oscars context of the 2011 year. And the 2011 year for me is such an odd year, a year I've never been able to get kind of a handle of. A lot of the kind of more modern Oscars years, of course, we've been doing this, covering the Oscars now for 10 plus years, 10 seasons on Old Oscar Countdown. So we were on the ground floor for many of the years. I can remember 2016 and what it felt like at the time and who we thought was going to win. But when you get back into older Oscars, I'm relying a little bit more on history and books that I've read and things like that, and just general consensus. But when you think about a year like, let's say, 1997, in which I wasn't following the Oscars back then, that year kind of makes sense, though, from a historical perspective. Oh, it was Titanic, it was the biggest movie of the year, it was the James Cameron kind of crowning achievement. Okay, that makes sense. So when I look back at a year like 2011, I'm just always confused. Why this movie? Why this time? Even the year generally, I talked about last week, 2012 wasn't my favorite year for the Oscars. Neither was 2011. Similarly, this year, only one of the Best Picture nominated movies are in my top 10, and I don't necessarily like a lot of these Best Picture nominees. It is kind of an odd year just personally. But then even just trying to understand it from a historical perspective, why was The Artist such a big hit? Why was it so embraced by the Academy? Was it just we wanted to reward, Hollywood, and Hollywood loves Hollywood? But it's just an odd artifact, I think, so many years later, that this French film came in and was a huge success at the box office and won Best Picture and swept the Oscars, and we were all just kind of okay with that. And I think in part it was because a lot of the expected big movies didn't necessarily hit. You had movies from Scorsese and Spielberg and Woody Allen, and in hindsight, maybe this could have been the Terrence Malick Oscars as well, with something like Tree of Life, but a lot of those outputs weren't necessarily seen as their best. Maybe a bit of a comeback for Woody Allen, but maybe not one of his better films. And similarly with Scorsese and Spielberg, I think that's definitely those two movies in War Horse and Hugo, probably in the bottom half agreed upon of their filmographies. So there's not necessarily people that are like, Hugo is Scorsese's best movie, So there is a little bit of a complication of it just being a weird year or a down year, where you have actually a lot of big names, but maybe not always their best work. You can maybe argue Malick's best work is Tree of Life, but that's kind of about it. My personal favorite would be Moneyball, but we're not talking about that on this episode. Then speaking about the acting categories, similarly, also odd and strange. Like, I'm glad Octavia Spencer or Christopher Plummer have Oscars, but for those films, not necessarily. Those aren't necessarily the iconic films that I think of. Maybe Octavia Spencer, but not personally. Definitely not for something like Christopher Plummer. Which brings us to the Best Actress category with Meryl Streep. So let's transition now into that. My first alternative nominated pick, someone who was nominated at the Oscars who didn't win that I think should have. I said it in the title of this video. It's Michelle Williams in My Week with Marilyn. Meryl Streep, in hindsight, I think, probably this isn't one of her best performances or one of her best Oscar-nominated performances. I recently listened actually to the Big Picture podcast, which is a great podcast, and they did like a Hall of Fame, and the Iron Lady wasn't even in consideration of making the Meryl Streep Hall of Fame top 10 kind of movies, which I thought is notable. And on one hand, like, I'm glad she has 3 Oscars. She is an actress that seems like someone who is in that upper class of one of the all-time greats, particularly when it comes to Academy Award nominations and wins. She is an elder stateswoman in that regard. But also, when you look back on it, you go, well, we probably wouldn't give an Oscar to this movie. Maybe a more typical late period movie of like a Devil Wears Prada or Mamma Mia, we would have given her the Oscar for. It's ultimately just kind of a good performance in a somewhat forgettable movie that I don't think has a lot of fans today. So it's a weird one for it to be her 3rd Oscar instead of maybe a more iconic role like, let's say, a Devil Wears Prada, or even more of a serious dramatic role later on, something like The Post. That would maybe even make a little bit more sense. This one just doesn't totally sit right with me, although I understand that she probably deserves 3 Oscars. This was just a weird one to go for it. So if we're going to go for a legendary, great performer who has a great performance in an okay movie, why don't we go with Michelle Williams in My Week with Marilyn? She was in a real key part of her career. She's an actress who I absolutely love and continues to do great stuff. I mean, just a few years ago was in The Fabelmans and was nominated for that and excellent in that movie. But this period in particular I think is really solid, where you go from Brokeback Mountain in, I guess, that was 2006, into 2008, Synecdoche, New York, the Charlie Kaufman film, which if you haven't seen is an excellent, excellent film. And then you have 2010, Shutter Island and Blue Valentine. She's nominated for Blue Valentine, and then a year later does My Week with Marilyn. So I do think she is an upper tier actress. Even if her movie doesn't work, she's always solid within the movie. She always gives a great performance, and I think is able to transform into these individual characters and does an excellent job here in My Week with Marilyn. And what I think she understands so much about Marilyn Monroe is that no one understands Marilyn Monroe. She is this kind of iconic figure that has multiple facets to her. She is, on one hand, this kind of sex pot brand of someone on a poster, of that kind of idealized version of, lust and beauty and Hollywood fame. But then she's also, an insecure actor at times who always needed a teacher around her and wasn't professionally trained. So committed while she was in Movie Stars to actually try to learn the art of acting and things like that. And then she had her own private life, which was a little bit different. So what I think Michelle is able to understand so well about the character of Marilyn Monroe is that she's different things to different people. And what's amazing about the movie and her performance is that by having Eddie Redmayne's character as the protagonist, and not Marilyn Monroe, it kind of gives us a distance. It kind of gives the audience a surrogate to look upon Marilyn Monroe as this mysterious figure of sorts. And it gives Michelle Williams it takes the load of the story off of her and says, you don't even need to tell the story or necessarily have deep empathy and drive plot mechanics or anything like that. Your job is just to be as dynamic as possible and change sometimes even within a scene. And one of my favorite scenes in this movie in particular is one of the first-ish scenes in which she invites him, Eddie Redmayne's character, to her room, her sort of house, and they have this kind of great back and forth and one-on-one. And it's this incredible magic trick because within Michelle Williams' performances, you see, I think, in one scene, the many different facets of Marilyn. At the beginning, when she invites him in, there's a sense of, I think, locked on gaze in which she's trying to be a little bit more like a detective at certain points and try to figure out what he knows and what her standing is within the cast. So there's this kind of direct intensity. She's trying to find out an answer. She's almost waiting for him to say something. Then she realizes maybe she was a little bit too intense and turns on kind of the charming Marilyn movie star, how she would maybe interact with fans and butters him up a bit. And then sometimes when she catches herself kind of talking about herself and her own acting, and you see maybe more of the real Marilyn come through, and you see Michelle Williams divert her eyes and becomes a little bit more self-conscious as she's speaking, and has that self-doubt creep in. So it's just amazing in this one scene where you see her kind of be beautiful and understand the kind of attention that so many people lock them onto, because she has that movie star charisma of being able to just be someone who's interesting to look at, and then also has that kind of, we'll call it hosting or charm charisma when she kind of settles him down, but then also has that self-doubt creep up. And on just the basic technical performance of the performance itself, it's just kind of fun to watch. It's fun to watch an actor who's totally in command of their craft switch between these different personas. And then of course thematically, I think it makes so much of a richer film, her scenes, because one scene she's one way, the other scene she's not. And I actually don't think that's a bug. I think that's a feature. I like the fact that in every scene she brings a sense of energy to the film that I think the movie definitely needs, and also positions her to be. But Michelle Williams delivers all these different types of Marilyn Monroe, and in a way captures her full essence, because she's able to show all different kinds of signs and switch in between that, sometimes within the same scene, sometimes within different scenes, but always dynamic, always magnetic, of course beautiful herself, but also I think able to understand her internal life and some of the definite insecurities supposedly that she had after reading some of the books that I have read about Marilyn Monroe, and knowing actually a good bit about her life. I did feel like Michelle was able to kind of capture her essence, both her screen persona, but then also the real person behind the scenes. It's a movie that I'm not necessarily saying go out and watch it. It's an absolute classic. But her scenes are so dynamic, so interesting. Every time she was on screen, I was always kind of sitting up in my chair. It's a movie that I had seen a few years back and then rewatched it again. And once again, I was just amazed, really focusing in on her performance. So I'm not necessarily saying this is an iconic role for her, but if we're going to give the Best Actress Award prize to an okay movie but a great performance, let's give it to Michelle Williams. She's never had one before. She still doesn't have one. Meryl already has a couple. So that was kind of my thinking, my analysis there of why I think Michelle Williams should have won here. And then my alternative unnominated pick, I had to go with another comedy. I went with Kristen Wiig in Bridesmaids. It seems like a lot of this kind of unnominated picks I've been going with like comedic performances or comedies, because I love comedies and they never get recognized for the Oscars. But what's so interesting about this is that Kristen Wiig actually was nominated for Bridesmaids, but for her screenplay, not for her performance. And this wasn't a crazy thing. That this definitely could have happened. I mean, Melissa McCarthy was nominated for Best Supporting Actress for Bridesmaids. So why not someone like a Kristen Wiig? This is, I think, an iconic comedic performance. I think it's totally committed to the film. That's what I love so much about it. Kristen Wiig personally is my favorite comedic actor by far, and I love everything she's in, and I think she's just so funny. And what I love about this performance in particular is that sense of commitment, which I mentioned, which is somewhat rare in the sense of I don't think she cares necessarily about being a movie star or necessarily even getting the most laughs in her own movie. And that's somewhat of a rare thing. When you think about Bridesmaids, it's not like the Kristen Wiig vehicle and she has to dominate and win every scene and she wrote the script and she gives herself all the best lines. I mean, she's very funny and has many great lines. When you think about the movie, if there's a scene that emphasizes Melissa McCarthy, that's in the script too, and she takes it over. Or Rose Byrne sometimes steals scenes from Kristen Wiig. So in the sense of commitment, it's, okay, what's going to be the funniest thing for the movie? So sometimes in certain scenes, Kristen Wiig is the kind of straight man in the film. She's not comedically 10 out of 10 all the time going crazy and super silly. Sometimes she does it to service the story, which I think is commendable as a performance, and her ability to know when to be the straight person and then when to be silly and crazy, in which she also is able to do that, whether it be sweating profusely or acting drunk on a plane. I'm not going to pretend that this is like some deep movie and there's a strong emotional core. It's pretty surface level. But guess what? It's funny. It's one of the funniest movies of the 21st century. She's the lead in it. She is so funny. There's so many iconic gifts from this movie. I still buy some of the romantic elements to it and some of that breakup of the friendship and that kind of attention that she's able to bring. It's on a heightened sense for sure. She is, portraying that very clearly to the audience, but still, in a very funny way. And I like her ability to similar to Michelle Williams, to kind of modulate her performance, whether she's being crazy in the silly one, the drunk one on the plane, and that's her scene, or kind of taking a back seat in the kind of a dress rehearsal, trying on the dress scene, when everyone has food poisoning. She's not the main, laugh part of that film. She allows the other people to kind of take stage there and is okay with that. So love Kristen Wiig. Crying that she doesn't have an Oscar, in my opinion, because she's delivered so many amazing, great comedic movies, and she'll probably maybe win an Oscar for like doing a supporting role in a dramatic movie, like so many of the great comedians. But why doesn't Will Ferrell have an Oscar for Anchorman, or Adam Sandler for Happy Gilmore? We all love these movies. They're all really, really funny movies. We like the actors. Why not necessarily those performances? That's what we're doing here. We're redoing the Oscars. Maybe she shouldn't have won, but she's my personal favorite, but give her a nomination. I mean, Melissa McCarthy got one, so it wasn't necessarily out of the realm of possibility. But now, to end off the episode, we try to figure out, did the Academy make the right choice? And for me, I'm going to go with no. In hindsight, I think maybe, at the time, rather, I think it was probably the right choice. You have a bunch of picks here that maybe you don't know if Michelle Williams is going to continue to be a great actor. So you go with like the safe pick, Meryl Streep in a biopic. No one's going to criticize them for giving Meryl Streep a third Oscar. But going back at it, I think I would have chosen differently, particularly with the fact that Michelle Williams still doesn't have an Oscar. This seems like a great opportunity, kind of in hindsight, to right that wrong. So it's kind of like did the Academy get it right? At the time, probably I would have said it's the fine, kind of correct, objective decision. But now looking back on it, I do think that The Iron Lady just isn't a movie that hasn't stayed with people at all. And it's going to be a little bit of an odd thing looking back on Meryl Streep's career and goes like, oh yeah, what did she win the third Oscar for? Oh right, yeah, Iron Lady. Like it's one of those kinds of movies versus with Michelle Williams. Maybe actually winning the Oscar here would have placed an emphasis more on My Week with Marilyn as a more legacy kind of a film, which has a great cast and I think is definitely entertaining. So, that may have benefited the film generally. So it's not like a complete crime, like teasing maybe next week's episode, I think is. But it is a definite kind of a choice where, in hindsight, my preferences definitely lie, I think, with Michelle Williams in My Week with Marilyn. But that's about it. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your picks for the 2011 Oscars. Who's your unnominated pick? And feel free not to just choose the Best Actress category. You can let me know, for Best Picture, you would have gotten with Moneyball over The Artist. That's totally okay to do as well. Just love to hear your thoughts down there in the comments, or just watch the video, like the video, and go about your day. Totally happy for everyone that just shows up and watches the videos as well. Deeply, deeply appreciative of how people have been resonating with this series so far, and I love the Oscars, and it's kind of a natural extension there. So I hope everyone continues to watch the videos and sticks around for the upcoming weeks. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.